Hi, and welcome to the Improvisors Podcast. I'm Neil Thomas, and this is my co-host, Kevin James.
Great. Thank you, Neil. In this podcast series, we chat with improvisers about their practices, about what informs their practices, their conceptualizations, and their aspirations. Who have we got on today, Neil?
Today, we're in conversation with Jim Denley. He muses upon his origin myths, the child and the sound of the sun, and the adolescent challenges of sounding on the top of mountains.
Jim speaks of special narcissism, of worlding, of earth song, of eco-musicality, and of indeterminacy.
Great. Enjoy.
Yes.
Good morning, Jim Denley, and welcome to the Improvisers Podcast. We're thrilled to be in conversation with you today. Maybe we can start with how you began working with sound. When did that happen?
I think it was at a very young stage. I had this memory of being 3 or 4 years of age, I imagine. So this, I don't know if this is a memory or more a myth, sort of a personal origin story or something. But I was in our family backyard in Wollongong, and I was playing with my sister. I heard this sound in the sky, and so I asked my sister, "What was that? What's that, Elizabeth?" And she looked up at the sky and she said, "The sun." But so, I mean, which is clearly the wrong answer to what I thought was my question. What was that sound? But I might have just said, "What was that?" And she kind of looked up at the sky and said, "The sun." Well, I mean, or on the other, so she could have misunderstood my question. She could have been pulling my leg, as an older sister might. She was 18 months older than me. I don't know. Or she really might have thought that the sun was that sound that I heard. So in that sort of moment, and the fact that it's a myth to me or a memory, I think there's this powerful moment where I understood there are sounds that were other in the world. And later on, I understood that sound was a crow. And I guess my parents might have informed me that it wasn't the sun, that it was a bird. And I guess that, so like sound in this sort of mythical story goes back pretty deep, I think, in my history, or my own personal sort of experience. And then I think I remember as a child always whistling, always singing. I had this idea that you could just sort of like hum or whistle new pieces of music. So I guess I hadn't formed an idea of improvisation, but I thought it was some sort of form of, replicating what composers did, sort of a compositionality, just sort of sitting there on my own, humming new material. I mean, I don't think it was particularly original or mind-blowingly, novel in any sort of sense of the word. But I remember sort of spending hours, sitting on a step, just sort of humming to myself. But then when I started playing the flute at about the age of 10 or 11, I guess, I already had this sort of a notion of improvisationality, that you could make up material to kind of play on an instrument. And this another sort of another personal mythology was important to this. I remember I must have been 12 years old. I think it was about 1969, with my father and my sister we climbed a mountain in Warumbungle National Park, Mount Exmouth, and I took my flute along with me, which is not the most obvious thing to do. Like, okay, pack a sandwich, some water, maybe a block of chocolate. But like, why is this 12-year-old kid taking his flute up the mountain? I mean, and then when we got to the top of Mount Exmouth, my dad sort of said, well, are you going to play something? And then the problem of what material to play became visceral or sort of manifest. I think I had a repertoire of some simple kind of Mozart pieces transcribed for flute. And I had a repertoire of, like, I bought Jethro Tull's first album, This Was. And so I could play one or two bits and pieces from Ian Anderson's flute playing on that record. But I was aware that on top of that mountain, with a bunch of eagles sort of spiraling above, this incredible view of the national park, and then the plains just going off into the west, the Siding Springs Observatory over to the east, the domes. You're kind of on top of this mountain with this incredible scene. It just became clear that a little bit of Mozart or Jethro Tull are totally inappropriate. And the 12-year-old kind of intuitively understood that one should play appropriate material. And I guess I had an understanding of improvisationality from my experience with some records that I'd been listening to. A lot of those from Chicago. There was a label called Delmark in the mid-1960s. And a lot of the artists of the Association for Advancement of Creative Music, which is the AACM from Chicago at the time, had been putting out these records on this label Delmark. And for some reason, this 12-year-old had been exposed to these records. And so, those records were extremely kind of improvisational. It was like very kind of advanced or experimental jazz from the time. Perhaps even, verging on what you would call improvised music, less jazz and stylistically away from the things that most people think of as being jazz. So, I'd been exposed to those records. And so I clearly had an idea or a notion or a way of, but this kind of relates to what I said earlier about sort of humming as a child, like this idea that you could just kind of make up material. So, I think those sort of origin stories, I mean, whether it's true or not, it's kind of a story I tell myself, like a form of truth that sort of makes sense of your childhood and then where you end up. But I think looking back, I'm trying to sort of make sense of why I was surprised on this moment on Mount Exmouth that Jethro Tull and Mozart were completely inappropriate. But then that also sort of leads me to this sort of notion of, in understanding that they were inappropriate and I should find different material, then there needed to be an explication of that I understood somehow that place had a particular spirit that demanded certain things from an expression.
I wonder what it would be like to think about composing for that composing for that place now, if it with those knowings, with all of the accumulated knowings of your life.
Yeah, I went back there this year because I was writing about this in my PhD. So I just wanted to sort of check the details to check that my memory, by being in the place, you kind of have this sort of something that's nearly 60 years old, like 50 something years ago, how clear your recollection is of the eagles and the top of the mountain and the grass trees and the view. I mean, I guess with memory, you're always sort of doubting that you've kind of romanticized or made this thing up. So earlier this year, I went back, climbed the same mountain, and it's kind of a spiraling path around the mountain. You don't go directly up; you sort of wind around. And I remember sort of maybe 3/4 of the way up, looking out, and almost at my eye level, and not too far away from me, maybe 20 meters away, was one of the, well, wouldn't have been the same wedge-tailed eagle, but it was, one of the wedge-tailed eagles, or the family of which might have been there in 1969. And then once I got to the top of the mountain, it all kind of made sense of my memory, where the things in the landscape were, the feeling that I had, the stones, the grass trees. So I think compose wouldn't be a thing I would do. Like on that day, I did what I did in 1969, which is to, improvise some music. I guess the difference was I took hard disk recorders up this time, but in 1969 I couldn't have done that. Our family owned a tape recorder, but it was very heavy, reel to reel. The Sony Walkman hadn't been invented yet, and I didn't have enough money for a Nagra. So I guess recording was part of my life then, even as a sort of, a 12, 13-year-old. So then that didn't seem odd to me too, to sort of replicate the experience by bringing by bringing hard disk recorders up. Because I think I would have done that if I could have done that. Or it's hard to say, but I was definitely involved at that stage in using the tape recorder at home. So if I'd have had access to that, I probably would have, well, that's speculation, but yeah.
Jim, I'm just reading a couple of things that that I think you had written or had been written about you, that somehow try and language the essence of your practice. And it sounds like really from that young age, looking up the sun and hearing the sound, your sister's suggestion was almost the remarkable origin story. That sort of, it feels like from very early in your life there was this sense of prospect and awareness. You write Jim Denley in the eternally orchestrating soniverse. It's also, you had written about co-creation with musickin, with the human and more than human domains. I guess everything you've been talking about up until now is expanding a little bit on this, but I would love to hear more about this sort of immersed, embedded way of sound making in the world, as distinct from many of the other improvisers we've spoken to, who are performance improvisers, who improvise to an audience and take it more directly, performatively. I'd love to know more about your world and your domain of exploration.
Yeah, I mean, I think I've ended up sort of being a bit anti the concert hall and the prescribed performance space if it's human only. So I guess, I've ended up in this space which is anthropocentric, so actively anthropocentric. I mean, the last couple of weeks I've actually done some concerts in, performance spaces with other human beings, and I enjoy it. I was playing a couple of weekends ago with Tony Buck, who's the drummer with the Necks, and Clayton Thomas, and I love both of those guys. We played music together, from way back. I've known them both for a very long time. And Clayton asked me if I'd do this gig, and I said yes, and I really enjoyed it. But there's something about that, a bunch of humans in a sort of a technology or an architecture that is isolating from the rest of worlding, which I find a bit sort of specially narcissistic. And if it's just about humans being discursive with other humans, and maybe an architectural space that is designed by other humans, so and then with an audience which is a bunch of other humans, I mean, to me, there's I think I've arrived at this position where I think it's untenable within the world we live in now, and with the knowledge that we have about our effects on the world. It's sort of this, it's like an anthro selfie or something, like, if that makes any sense. So I've arrived at a position where I think, to make sense of, Bruno Latour sort of says we've got to choose between modernizing and ecologizing. The two things aren't compatible. So I guess I'm choosing ecologizing over modernizing. And that the whole modernization project for the last 300 or 400 years or something like that has been the sort of, and it's problematic because I love, as I suggested, I'm reading this book about Schoenberg. Yeah, I love Schoenberg. I love Pierre Linaire. But I have to sort of say, knowing what I know about our effects or humanity's effects as weather, or our effect as worldings, that we have to stop this exclusivity and the sort of notion of human exceptionality, that I've had, not that I've had enough of it, because as I said, I can enjoy that thing and I love some of that material and the work. But I think we need another approach, which means we're actually sort of engaging with all other elements and species, energies, and like to engage with critters as a critter, to engage with energies as an energy, to engage with place as a kind of maker of place, to engage with, so to not sort of see ourselves as separate. And like my last 3 records, I think, and attempting to sort of deal with this. The first one, which was an early version of the work I called In Weather, where I thought I was out there in the world, outside of rooms and those sort of exclusionary technologies of isolation. I was going outside and I was in weather. And then after a while, after that was released, I kind of went, no, I'm not in weather, I'm with weather. I'm there. I'm not inside this thing. I'm there, part of this thing, playing with the weather. And then like a year on, the last record is as weather. And I think that's kind of much more profound. Like, I mean, we know that humans affect weather. That we know, just like trees and all the other beings on this, beavers and all the other beings on Earth, that we affect the weather. And clearly scientists have told us that we are effective of weather. So then it seemed much more profound to sort of say, as weather, to play music as weather. And I would sort of argue that, from these points, I guess there've been a number of points on, all artists should be adopting that sort of notion that one should play as weather, and then I guess, of course, to make sense of that in an Australian context, one goes to lots of texts by Aboriginal scholars that tell you exactly that country is everything, and one to kind of properly sort of make sense of place or country, one's work should be sort of earth song.
Jim, it seems that we're talking about, and you've obviously lived this for a long time, this sort of deep ontological shift of our place in the world, and how we are constantly worlding and being worlded, and how we are just simply a part in an embedded universe of more than humannesses and beings. It's so energizing to hear you speak of this, and to hear that your work is living this out. That's not a question; it's sort of a comment and a confirmation. And I'll make one other confirmation. We spoke to a number of people prior to this interview today that just let them know we were going to be chatting with you, and people were using words like, wow, Jim Denley, the grandfather of experimental music. And so there's something honouring in what I'm saying about the ontologies of which you speak, and the world in which you are both inhabiting and inviting others to be party to. Again, that's not a question, but maybe it is. Maybe, Jim, you could speak a little bit more about where you're at right at the moment.
I mean, I think what attracted me to improvisation is that, and I go back to the top of the mountain in the Warumbungle National Park, is that sort of understanding that the material has to be specific to place, and it has to be kind of appropriate material, that you can't just sort of drag in a bit of Mozart or a bit of Jethro Tull or a bit of previously played Jim Denley, like that, and that one should embrace the indeterminism of that desire. So indeterminacy is sort of central to the whole thing. And then if one takes that sort of really seriously, then I think you have to kind of end up saying that everything is indeterminate, that nothing is kind of predetermined, nothing is pre-shaped, pre-ordered in any way. And improvisation should be, if it's to be kind of flowing through as an idea, then it has to sort of really embrace that indeterminacy. So of course there's other ways of thinking of it, that you have these sort of modules of compositional sort of modules that you kind of develop and practice, and then stylishly sort of insert into moments. And I guess there's always a degree of that, like, but I think if you're going to take the idea seriously, then that should feel, slightly wrong or a bit hypocritical. But if you are really going to sort of embrace indeterminacy, then one shouldn't think of anything as being predetermined. Your material, your identity, the place itself, everything's kind of up for grabs. So I'm kind of very attracted to sort of philosophy that speaks to that, profound indeterminacy. And so the last few years I've been reading a lot of Karen Barad, who's this philosopher who kind of explains a profound indeterminacy where nothing is predetermined before interaction. And she uses that word interaction to acknowledge that in this sort of the pre-interactive moment, everything is undefined, everything is amorphous. The other philosopher I really like is Merleau-Ponty, and Merleau-Ponty sort of talks about a sort of a pre-individual pulp, like that. He uses that word pulp for stuff that hasn't yet been defined in worlding. So through worlding, things get sort of defined, and we make distinctions. But if you kind of really embrace indeterminacy, then everything sort of is profoundly sort of amorphous, and that means everything. So that one can't sort of enter an improvisation with very strong notions of self, with very strong notions of the individual or other individuals. And I think that seems to be kind of slightly absurd to some people, like clearly Jim Denley is a thing, and we have very strong sort of notions of self. But I think I can explain it very clearly through a piece of music that I worked on by David Ahern, who's this composer from the late 1960s, early 1970s in Sydney. He worked on a composition with Roger Frampton, who was a saxophonist who he worked with. And it's a work for kind of feedback, really. Like, as a lot of sound artists and composers were doing around that time, they were deeply attracted to audio feedback. So David and Roger set up this situation where Roger placed microphones in his saxophone, and then David was on mixing desk and mixing console, amplifying that with a sort of a sound system to the point of sort of super saturation, where tones will just be produced by the feedback system. But then you can control those tones by different fingerings in the saxophone, or moving into different places in the room, or moving towards the speaker. So you set up this sort of very volatile, extremely volatile, extremely indeterminate sonic, is it landscape the right word? Sonic experience or event. And I think in that moment, when you play that piece of music, the distinction between the David character and the Roger character, or in my case, the sound engineer I'm working with, dissolves entirely. Like there's sort of this dissolution of identity. I don't know whether I've been the major agent in a change in tonality through my use of fingering or my position in the room, or the sound engineers have turned certain frequencies up. Like there's no way of knowing who's the agent of a particular phenomena that occurs. And you have this very visceral experience of becoming one with the other musician you're working with and the whole system. So what I bring to it is clearly a history of being able to play my instrument, but that can mean very little, like at various stages, because so dexterity can be completely overridden by the supersaturation of the audio system or the sound engineer filtering out certain frequencies or filtering in certain frequencies, or turning the gain up a little bit. So, in that environment, effectively you become conjoined. So it's, there seems to be like a visceral example of what I mean, and it seems fairly clear that that's true. You're no longer Jim Denley, the musician. You're Jim Denley with somebody else, like you completely conjoined, and the resulting, it's a true kind of co-creation. But then I think this is what happens, or should happen, fundamentally in improvisation as well. That identity shouldn't really be there just to like if you're genuinely being indeterminate, genuinely embracing the improvisationality, then any sort of preconceived idea of yourself or the others is actually an impediment to the work. But it's very difficult to do, and it doesn't happen all the time. And there are times within an improvisation you become very aware of yourself and your history, your predilections, your aesthetics. So maybe it's sort of a form of idealism. It's which can be attained at times. Like occasionally I sort of go, well, I think from that moment on in the performance, or listening back to recordings, from a certain stage in the recording, I feel like I've entered that zone, or and then it may sort of resort back, and you kind of lose that flow, or that sort of dissolution of the self, and become very aware of self. And maybe also like there's another word I quite like, which is Gilbert Simondon often talked about metastabilities, where things sort of plateau out and seemingly are reasonably stable for a while. And then other things can come along, energies and can shift the thing into a new sort of structuring, can reconfigure what's happening at particular times. I don't know if that sort of responds to your prompt.
Well, it's wonderful to hear you articulate, Jim. So resonates so strongly. It makes me prompts for me questions around the self and the nature of the self, and experiences of improvising where other aspects of yourself perhaps arrive, other sort of metaphors that perhaps improvisation is dipping into the to the subconscious, and that release of the sort of one ego self and submitting to the bigger self. But however it's phrased, it's really slippery stuff, but there's definitely there's something, I think it's on the money. In racing terms, it's on the money. I had a question around, I guess a lot of the talk we've been having so far has been about process of making the work, and from the point of view of the maker. That, and also a really clear articulation of commitment to a different world. How do you see the role of that's a big question. How do you see the role of your art making in society? How do you see that affecting people? What you're doing, how does that, talk about that a little?
Yeah, that's maybe I don't think about it too much, like truthfully, in that sort of the notion of sort of phases of individuation, or taking the sort of self as, rather than an individual, as an individuating being, and that you never sort of arrive at anything fixed. So the indeterminacy, when we're talking about the performer, is profound, but that should extend to everything involved in the phenomena, all the phenomena involved in the event. So that the distinction between me and audience is indeterminate as well. So the notion of like an active maestro on stage and a passive audience sort of perceiving the event doesn't interest me very much. Like I can see no, I mean, to kind of properly kind of perceive a performance, I think is a very active, so that, I think the people perceiving the event, whether they be avian, human, maybe even geomorphic sort of beings, they're as indeterminate as anything else, and can be reconfigured by the interaction. So if musicking is sort of this, if musicking is an interaction or a kind of intraplay between all the sort of as yet to be defined things within the event, then the audience is kind of has to be, if you kind of follow that through logically, then the audience is as much part of that as the performers, or the performer in my case. So I don't sort of see there to be sort of a massive distinction between the performer and audience, or that distinction doesn't interest me that much. I mean, clearly within the sort of ritualized performances that we sort of call the concert, it is very much demarcated that should be the case. But so much of the work that I try and do attempts to sort of deconstruct that. So I'm not much interested in the conventional concert hall, you know, the audience in rows with a proscenium on a stage. So if I take a group of other people and other beings, like it doesn't have to be human beings, to a place, and if I engage in sort of listening, hearing, and playing and expressing myself within or with that place or as that place, the listening, hearing, expressing is already in, you know, the musicking is already a sort of a listening, hearing expression. And so the audience have to do much of the same work, it seems to me. So they're not sort of a separate audience. And ideally they should be able to sort of join in. Like if it's a bunch of arboreal or avian beings, they kind of join in. Like if I'm outside, the trees will sound, the birds will sound, the elements will sound, and ideally, yeah, that's an interesting one. Ideally, I think I'd like any being that was there to feel free to sound, to be expressive if they felt the need. So I remember a concert I went to some years ago, but John Rose was playing in a cave in the Blue Mountains, and it's a magnificent cave. It easily fits 60 to 80 people sitting on the sand. It's a very nice acoustic. It faces out into the northern side of the Blue Mountains. There's kind of very little suburban noise from the town on the other side. Yeah, it's a really great place to play music. And John was doing this concert with a young double bass player, and there was quite a big audience, maybe 50 to 60 people. But because it was a daytime concert in a cave in the Blue Mountains, lots of people had brought kids, and there was one toddler who just, you know, heard the music. John was playing away and the double bass player was playing away, and then she just joined in, and everybody there in the cave thought that was delightful. You know, it was just the sound of a toddler unselfconsciously joining in with that beautiful sound that toddlers can make before language. And you say, well, yeah, what is if a kookaburra had sort of flown down and landed on a branch and, you know, joined in, that would have been delightful. If an aeroplane had sort of gone across the sky, you would have had to accept that, and that's an amazing sound. You know, like this sort of opening up to sort of a pan-aurality to the indeterminate, you know, the indeterminacy and unboundedness of that event, then I think you have to be kind of open to anything. And I mean, I guess one should say that there's responsible expression. So I thought the toddler was being responsible, like they were kind of responding in a way which was kind of appropriate for the event. But you know, I guess there's irresponsibility as well. Like you could ruin what John and the double bass player were doing, which I don't think the toddler was, but like if it had become a sort of much wider movement where everybody in that cave decided they were going to join in, I mean, Yeah, I guess that's an interesting question. Like,
Jim, we're going to start to need to draw this to a closure soon.
right.
I just wanted to toss in a very simplistic generalization about improvisation, and in part it's prompted by listening to you, and I would invite your comment on it. But I love the word worlding, which you use. It's one I'm very attracted to. But there's something about when improvising, it's our availability to manifesting the moment and being manifested by the immediate context, and the sort of immersion in that process that you use the word indeterminacy a lot, and I think that sits at the heart of it. But it is to do with availability, I think, and it is to do with with manifesting and being manifested, and somehow conceding to that as a process. Would you comment on that a little in passing as we're heading towards a finish?
Okay, I'll try and be brief. But the notion that what you've just expressed there suggests an understanding of temporality, and any sort of discussion on temporality must be ambiguous. Like, it just takes you off into a world which, I mean, can you explain now? I mean, I don't think anyone can explain the concept of now. It's something that we feel we understand, and yet as soon as we try and rationalize it and talk about it logically, I think you're in deep water, or you have to use an awful lot of words. I mean, it's not some sort of notion of it, it's a thin slither of time, space mattering. Doesn't, I don't know, who knows what that means? Like, it's almost impossible to say, but somehow improvisers often talk about this sort of kind of attachment to immanence, or to be in the moment. It's the now, like Derek Bailey uses that phrase. So there's sort of this idea that you can somehow talk about immanence, immediacy, now, and that makes any sense. The more I think about it, the less sense it makes. That any now that I'm in now includes the now that I was in on the top of Mount Exmouth when I was a 12-year-old, which includes the 4-year-olds now in the backyard in Wollongong, which includes my understanding of what the sound of a crow is, and the sun. Like, like these things are a part of our, also traces into the past that inherently affect our immersion in now. But then there are traces that go into the future as well. Like, one can't help but, and Pauline Oliveris uses this word oralize, to sort of imagine through sound. Musicking is, to take the future out of musicking is absurd. Like, you don't sort of just exist in this sort of extreme slither of now. You have thoughts about where you're going to go, and that there are traces or tracks into the future, as well as the tracks that go into the past. So, I think any discussion around this ends up with inevitably with a sort of an understanding of temporality. And maybe one of the best ways I can explain that one should have non-linear notions of temporality is, I was up on a mountain near Narooma with an Aboriginal elder, and he showed me some amazing granite rocks there. His name is Dwayne, and one of the they're not sort of a granite rock, but one of the natural forms he showed me is like this enormous, big, fat granite rock with one on top of it, and then a third one which is pointing towards the sky. And you look at this thing and you just go, how could that thing have formed? It's like almost impossible to imagine how these three rocks could have arrived at this. It feels more sculptural, like, anthropocentric way than sort of natural, but it is a natural thing. And then he explained in the Yuan cosmology, the bottom rock is the past, the middle rock is now, and the top rock is the future. And that, clearly these rocks are not sort of placed next to each other in a sort of a linearity. They're right on top of each other. And that was his conception, or Yuan conception, of temporality. And the more I delve into sort of thinking about temporality in an improvisational sense, the more meaningful that is to me. That I think the insistence that we're in something that you can understand as a thin slither of now makes absolutely no sense to me. And the only people who, I guess there are some people who are tormented by being in a thin slither of now, and most of them are very, very sick. Like, it feels like, Alzheimer's to me. To be in a thin slither of now seems like torture, or like a very horrible sort of notion. You can't remember the past, and you can't imagine a future. But then we're still so stuck with these three words, past, now, and future.
Jim, I think I'm just thinking of now and needing to finish now.
So I'll try to do that briefly.
So I is there a now or is there not? But we need to finish NOW. How wonderful to swim in the ocean with you today, or to have you swim with us, or whatever the metaphor might be. Jim Denley, thank you so much for today. It's been an absolute pleasure to immerse in your world.
It's a very great pleasure and fun to be able to talk to you guys.
Yeah. Thanks very much, Jim. A lot of illumination.